Today's episode has been brought to you by Schedulicity.
And also by the Pelvic Health Professionals membership. And I have some very exciting news. If you are interested in becoming a member, the doors are opening today to everyone who is on the wait list. So if you did not see an email from me, make sure you ask me about it. Ask me for that email because there's an early invitation to join for everyone who's on our wait list. Visit pelvichealthprofessionals.com for more information. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I'm a mom of 3, a yoga teacher, and a trainer and consultant who works for yoga teachers. And this podcast was created for you because I get what it's like to be a yoga teacher, to be focused on so many parts of teaching yoga as well as running a small business, because that's what you're doing as a yoga teacher. In today's episode, we're diving into something that affects a lot of people: anxiety. The Anxiety and Depression Association of America reports that today, anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the U.S., affecting 1 in 5 people. And in Canada, 1 in 4 Canadians. That's 25% if you're Canadian. So 1 in 5 people in the U.S., 1 in 4 people in Canada will have at least one anxiety disorder in their lifetime, according to the Anxiety Disorders Association of Canada. Globally, the World Health Organization statistic is that almost 300 million people have an anxiety disorder. This means if you're teaching yoga, there's a pretty high likelihood that 1 or more of your students may be dealing with anxiety, or some of them may even be coming to yoga to help with their anxiety. I saw this statistic come to life in our yoga studio when I was a yoga teacher, and we had a form where people would check off if they had knee pain, hip pain, back pain, anxiety, depression, and there was this whole little checkbox thing. And more often than not, anxiety was checked off. So when yoga students come to our class and they're dealing with anxiety, how can we help them? And what are some of the things that we need to be aware of? Amanda Whiting joins me to share some insights on this topic. We talk about how yoga can be part of the prescription for mental health, why loving kindness is important, and even what happens if someone has a panic attack in your class. Amanda approaches this sensitive topic with openness and heart, and I'm excited that we all get to learn from her. If there's something that you hear in today's episode and you want to go back to a specific place, or you need a link, all of that is over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/149. Another way to find things is go to theconnectedyogateacher.com, use our search bar, and just search for anxiety, and it will bring you to this episode. Before we meet Amanda, I want to give a huge shout out of thank you to Mariana, who left a comment on Yoga Anytime. So I have some online classes there. If you go to yogaanytime.com, you'll see them there. And I'll even put a promo code in our show notes where you can go and get a free month of Yoga Anytime classes with me. So Mariana said, Shannon, as an extremely discerning person of people and teachers, can I please tell you how safe, kind, empowering, and powerful your classes are? Your manner is the ideal of a trauma-informed practice. Your languaging and openness a haven. Love your slight wry humor in various episodes. My body feels held in your classes. Please do lots more classes. They're extremely accessible to so many. Thank you so much for leaving this comment, Mariana. It means a lot. And it is such an honor that you're practicing with me and that you took some time to share what that's like. So if you would like to practice with me on Yoga Anytime, go to our show notes, go to theconnectedyogateacher.com/149, and I will make sure that there's a link there that you get 30 days free. I also want to give a huge shout out of thanks to our podcast sponsor, Schedulicity. As many of you know, I have been using Schedulicity since 2011. I love their scheduling software. I am looking at my new year, and I know that it really helps me to use their software to stay organized. So let's hear our hot tip of the week from the team over at Schedulicity.
Hello, Connected Yoga teachers. This is Courtney with the Schedulicity Hot Tip of the Week. Sometimes when you're starting your business, it can feel like all of the responsibilities on your shoulders. But our award-winning support team is here to help. You can reach us 7 days a week for a phone call, live chat, or email question. When you're on Schedulicity.com, click the purple speech bubble button in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and say hello. We love to help, and we're excited to watch things fall into place for your business. You got into this business to do yoga, not to have to run a business. So let us handle the business and you handle the yoga.
With over 2,000 hours teaching and over 800 training hours, Amanda can say with certainty that teaching is her passion. Amanda first started yoga as a 20-something-year-old looking for a way to relax, but eventually became serious about yoga in 2012. As someone who has been managing her own anxiety since she was 2 years old, Amanda is no stranger to anxiety. Yoga has taught her that through postures, breath work, and meditation, anxiety becomes more manageable, strength becomes apparent, and an overall sense of well-being is inevitable. Today, Amanda helps others work through and manage their own anxiety and mental health conditions through a variety of yoga classes, workshops, and retreats, as well as free meditations, yin classes, and yoga nidra. Her desire to inspire others is apparent in her teaching, where she brings together yoga philosophy, alignment principles, and a sense of realness. Let's get into this interview. I am so excited to bring Amanda here onto the podcast. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Amanda. It's great to have you here today.
It's so amazing to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I am excited that we are going to talk about some mental health and how yoga can help with that, anxiety. Before we get into that, I'd love to know, what is the work that you do now and how did you get there? Because I'm guessing it started with I took a yoga class. Maybe it didn't.
It started a really long time ago, without aging myself, close to 4 decades ago, that I had my first panic attack when I was 2 years old. And obviously, this was the very early 80s. No one had any idea what panic or anxiety really was. And so it kind of just progressed. I have always had anxiety. I have always struggled with anxiety. And it really began to interfere with my life, my relationships, my everyday everything. And when I was in my early 20s, I went to a yoga class, and I would love to say that that's where I had this aha moment, but it wasn't. I just really enjoyed what it felt like to move my body in a way that felt safe. And I was only diagnosed with an anxiety disorder when I was 23. So if you do the math, that's 21 years of undiagnosed anxiety. And that unfortunately is probably not only the norm, but sometimes it can be longer for people to be on this journey. And then when I moved to Edmonton, I kind of did yoga on and off. I did prenatal yoga and postnatal yoga with my babies. And then I met the owner of a yoga studio through our kids in kindergarten. They introduced us and told us that we needed to be friends. And so I started attending her studio. And there was a class for yoga for anxiety. And I thought, well, why not? And that's where I really had this overwhelming sensation of, I need to do this. I need to do this more. I need to do this often. And I need to not only do this, but I need to pay attention to what this is doing.
Okay, so you were going to yoga, but it wasn't until you went to this class. And what was different about this class?
It was very much structured around what is anxiety and what can you do to help yourself. There were some poses, there was music, we did coloring of mandalas one day. And I'm still I'm very close with the yoga teacher whose class I went to. And her and I have actually gone and taught yoga for mental health up in Northern Alberta together for a 2-day workshop up there. And she was really a pivotal part of my journey to well-being.
That's amazing. So explain to our listeners who haven't had an anxiety attack or don't know what does that feel like? You were 2 when you had an anxiety attack.
I was 2 and I crawled up my mother. And truthfully, I don't remember a lot, but my mom can definitely depict, now that I know that this was anxiety, I understand that these things were as a result of anxiety, as opposed to me just being a difficult child. But now it really varies from person to person. Some people, the biggest to the biggest extent, you honestly can feel like you're dying.
Right.
That is one of the biggest things. You can feel like you are not actually going to survive. There's lots of different things that can happen. You can feel really detached. You can start sweating. Your heart can start beating quickly. Even though, there's likely not enough time to get into the nervous system and the sympathetic versus parasympathetic, but I know you've also done podcasts on that before. So maybe you can link back to some of those.
Mhm.
But for some people, there's this, feeling of like everything is in the extremities, because when there's panic, it's really this fight or flight that's happening. For others, it can feel like you can't move and that everything is all internal. So, people can get really brutal diarrhea. They can throw up. They can start shaking. When I get severe panic attacks, I can't hear anything. So, people talking to me is all well and good, but it literally sounds like the Charlie Brown teacher of I can't understand what a word formation might look like. So there's a lot of different aspects, and then you can get symptoms within each of those that range from, really minor tingling and a little bit of shortness of breath to the extreme of, laying down in the fetal position, not able to move, not able to see anything, not able to hear anything, feeling like you're having a heart attack. And then there's everything in between.
Right. So it's so individual. I love that there's not like bam, 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 you have these symptoms. It must be a panic attack or an anxiety attack. Are those words interchangeable? Can we
In
say
the
them
case
both?
of the attacks, yeah, they're totally interchangeable.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what I'd love to I have a question for you, a curious question. I just recently heard, you know what? Our brains are wired for this. Like if we were diligent and we paid attention to the things that we needed to be like fleeing from or fighting against way back when we were really surviving as humans, then those people who had higher anxiety, or I don't know if that's the right term, then they would survive. So then we have more people wired that way. Or other people will say, well, it's a stressful society, like we're a fast-moving society, so that's why we're seeing more of this. Do you have any thoughts on like why this exists?
I have a lot of thoughts on why it exists. And I think that it can be a byproduct of everything. When you look back, yes, we needed to be able to fight or flight when we were battling as primitive beings. Absolutely. The reality is we are all descendants from those primitive beings. So there would be some genetic component to it. Who knows how much watered down it gets or how increased it gets or what have you from those days. But then, we are being bombarded by so much, and there's not a lot of filters to what we are now being bombarded with. And I think that is potentially increasing what is happening in our world and the heightened anxiety. Even if you look back, I like to use the example of when I had my kids, they're almost 12 and 13. My husband sent out an email to everyone when I had my son. He was born early, so nobody was expecting it. And so he sent out an email just saying, just FYI, Amanda had the baby. They're in the hospital. Everything's okay, blah, blah, blah. And then he printed off all of the responses and brought them into me at the hospital and read them to me. Now, if a friend has a baby, I get a text sometimes 30 minutes later
Right.
with a picture.
Right.
And, so it starts very early on. And that's 12 years ago to now.
Right.
So then we go back 40 years, even 50 years. I have terrible math right now of World War II. And I guess it's over 65 years ago. And, it was newspapers and telegrams. It wasn't constant barrage of streaming and things happening right now, so there's very much a difference in, yes, we live in a very fast-paced, chaotic world, absolutely, but it's also everything is a right now society.
Right.
And, a therapist probably 15 to 20 years ago now said, part of your healing needs to be that you don't read the news. Because
Right.
I had, I would go into work in the morning and I would check my email and then I would read CNN and CTV and the Ottawa Citizen and this and that. And I'd be like, okay, cool, I'm up on the world. And
Right.
she's like, you need to not be up on the world. And even now to this day, I don't read the news. And really, anytime anything happens, I read about it on Facebook or Instagram or, somebody sends me a text. And even that is right away.
Right.
So, we live in this right away society.
Yes.
And
So
I think
true.
that's really, it's a blessing and a curse.
So this is interesting also that you had this when you were 2 years old, because I'm sure you weren't reading the news then.
No.
So it also lets me know, like, this is something that you were wired with, and then you
Mhm.
learned how to cope with, even though you weren't being diagnosed for so long in your life. So how has that informed the work that you do now? Like, what is the work that you do now?
So a lot of the work that I do now is honestly focused on getting people to reconnect to what it means to love themselves and to have compassion for themselves. We have so much ability to love others and to have compassion for others. And yet, somewhere along the way, it's become that that's not okay for us to have for ourselves. And that's really where my work has started taking me, is into this, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor, and I don't propose to be, and I know that it's not my responsibility to fix people. That said, if I can give people some tools on how to reestablish this connection to themselves, whether it is through love and compassion, whether it's through a mind body connection, whether it's through an awareness practice, I'm going to do everything that I can to get people more connected to where they are.
Right. And I feel like it can feel really out of reach if you say, like, oh, love yourself. If somebody
Yeah,
tells you, like, you need to love yourself. Okay, well, what does that mean? Like, because we do have a loud inner critic often,
hmm
saying, oh, you shouldn't have said that. Why do you look like this? Why do you sound like this? Why did you write that?
totally.
Look at this other person, look what they're accomplishing. Why aren't you doing that? Usually we're our own worst critic.
Yeah. 100% we are. And it's so easy. I mean, when I teach yoga for anxiety, because I teach yoga for anxiety in teacher trainings, like in 200-hour trainings, and I do a little bit of it in 300-hour, and then I also teach a yoga for anxiety training. I always say, if it was as easy as let it go, love yourself, and calm down, the entire world would be fine. But the reality is that doesn't happen. And wouldn't it be great if it did, but it doesn't. So how can we even open to the possibilities that this could happen?
Right.
And that's what I resonate with is, if we open to the possibility that one day we may have love for ourselves, what could that do to shift our entire perception of ourselves, and what can that do to shift some of our neural pathways?
So how do because I love how you brought up that this is a neural pathway. Like, we get into this
Mhm.
habit of doing that. do you have like a starting spot or a few, like, here's my top 3 ways to start to build that?
Yeah, absolutely. The first one is noticing. You really we can't do anything about it unless we notice. And awareness, and I think you'll probably hear me say this blessing and a curse multiple times because it seems to be one of my favorite things to say, but awareness is a blessing and a curse. Once you're aware, you can't become unaware. And sometimes things were really nice when we could avoid them. This
Right.
ostrich syndrome. And, if people are really interested in terms of yogic philosophy, looking at the kleshas is a really beautiful place to start. Um, but this, we can avoid things and then it's like, you don't have to deal with them if they're not in front of your face. And there's something really easy about that. The long-term effect of that is not good. In the moment, it's really easy to avoid it. Um, but when you start to notice, that's where we can start to precipitate change. And I want to be really clear that this isn't about changing who people are at their core, because I think at the core, everyone is just good. There's so much goodness in people, and it's really enlightening that core and getting that core to become a brighter part of who you are, and letting others see that you are this goodness and this light and this wonderful being. But first, you need to see that maybe you are.
Right.
So noticing is my absolute top thing.
So we notice, like, when we have those thoughts of
Yeah.
where it doesn't sound like a loving thought to self.
Exactly. And I think too, the mistake that people can sometimes get into is then they can say, well, that was a really mean thought. That's awesome. Not
Right.
realizing that reaction is the exact same reaction, or is the exact same thing as that initial thought. When you think about judgment is both good and bad. So if you're like, yay, I noticed, that's a judgment. And if you're like, wow, that sucked, that's a judgment. And so, this noticing, and then even acknowledging, like, I just had that thought. Okay, I had that thought. And I like to make things easy, because this work is not easy. And this work is not a quick fix. I'm 41, and my first panic attack was at age 2. I was diagnosed at 23. That's 21 years I went undiagnosed. It's now been 18 years since I was diagnosed, and I'm still working on this. This is not a quick fix. So, but what happens if we notice? What happens if we acknowledge? And what happens if the next time we notice faster and we acknowledge faster? What could that mean? Can you then reframe it in a way that is kind to yourself?
So if we think to ourselves like, "Oh, I look terrible in that picture."
Then notice, like, okay, I just said I look terrible. I acknowledge that I just said that. And what can I see in this picture that can make me happy? Who was I with in this picture? Where was I in this picture? What memory does this bring back in the picture that can cause a feeling of being at peace?
Okay.
And can you look at it in terms of, not how your face looks or your hair looks? Like, are you wearing earrings that you really loved? Are you wearing a shirt that you think, hey, I wore that shirt to this other thing that I really remember being a good time? And can you reframe it? It doesn't have to be going from, I look terrible in this picture, to, wow, that's the hottest I think I've ever looked. Because again, that's unrealistic. So,
Right.
how can we create realistic parameters around this?
Okay. Oh, this is so good. So this is kind of where you would begin, is being aware, trying to reframe it. Are there any other tricks or tips that have worked or that you share with other people?
I love the loving kindness meditation, and I will totally share it with you, because mine
Okay.
is a little bit unique in the sense that I don't do the typical loving kindness meditation that you can find everywhere. Um, and I only do it to myself to start. So
Nice.
typically in a loving kindness meditation, you do it first to yourself, somebody that you love, somebody that you're in conflict with, and then maybe the entire world.
Right.
if you are someone who is struggling with accepting and loving yourself and having compassion for yourself, you need to focus on you. Like, this needs to be all about you. Also, as I mentioned a little bit ago, I like to make things as easy as possible. And if you do a loving kindness meditation to yourself, it takes 90 seconds.
Right.
And almost everyone can find 90 seconds. I do my loving kindness meditation every single night before I go to bed. That's my
amazing.
designated routine time. I have somebody else who does it every day they get on a bus, because they bus back and forth from work. So they get on the bus, they sit down, they do their loving kindness meditation. So finding that time where you are not responsible. So please don't do it when you're driving, because you need to be able to focus on you when you're doing this, which means you're not focusing on the road, which I don't recommend doing. But if you go to Tim Hortons every morning and get a coffee, it's going to take you 90 seconds to get through the drive-through. Maybe that's the time to do it. Or when you sit down at your desk in the morning, or if you drop your kids off at school, sit for 90 seconds before you drive away and do it then. There's all kinds of times that we can take this 90 seconds to do this loving kindness meditation.
So help our listeners out who might feel like, well, how is this going to help me or my students who are dealing with anxiety? Like, where does the self-compassion and this loving kindness, how does that fit?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because typically when there is a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of anticipation. There's a lot of it's this weird combination of a lack of focus and a hyper focus. So often people will have a lack of focus on everything to do with them, because all their experience has been in their body has been all about, get away, get away, get away. And so this brings them back into them. So creating that mind-body connection. And why that's important is that typically there are warning signs when you are going to have a panic attack. If you do not have a strong connection between mind and body, and often people have very little connection between mind and body, it's very difficult to see where those signals are coming from. So for example, my signal, I always get a tingling on the right side of my chest that starts to then radiate outwards and go into my arms. I feel that tingling, I know that I'm coming into a panic attack. I had no idea that that was my signal until about 5 years ago.
So is there something then that you do if you feel that signal?
Yeah, then I have my whole tool kit that I have created. So for me, I have a pawn mudra, which is your middle finger and your ring finger and your thumb finger. And I can send you a picture of this. I also call it the fox face. So I can send you a picture of it for you to share. I also, for me, bringing my hands down to my lower belly is a big help for me, because it gets me out of my head and draws me as close down to my root as I can get. So drawing that attention down for some groundedness, and then sometimes some weight. So sometimes I'll, if I have someone around me, I'll ask them to give me a hug, or, even putting a pillow over my legs can just bring that attention down so that I have tons of other tools and tricks that I've used, but tools and tricks are also very specific to each person.
Right.
So, it's about finding what works. And when, just one more thing on that, and then I'll go back to this connection. But my recommendation is, when you're trying these new things to see, okay, how can I help to bring myself down, is to try one for a good week every time it happens, or even a month before moving on to the next one. Because if you try them all, you have no idea which one it was that worked and which one it didn't.
Right.
And then you all of a sudden are like, great, I have 6 things to do every time I feel a panic attack coming on.
Right. Okay, that's really smart.
Yeah, so starting small of like, no, it might not work the first time. So that's why it's like giving it a chance of, trying one thing for, if you're somebody who has panic attacks every day, or somebody who gets anxious every day, because there is also a difference between a panic attack and feeling anxious. Trying that every day for a week and saying like, no, it's the end of the week and I really don't notice a difference. Leave that one, move on to the next thing. And then when something works, you can still, after a week, say, okay, that works. I'm going to keep doing that and do this other thing, or I'm going to stop doing that and do this other thing because I know that if this other thing doesn't work, I can go back to that.
Right.
So that you're giving yourself some options. Because, for example, for Upon Mudra, I can do this anytime. I can do it when I'm teaching because it's a mudra.
Right.
You know,
and
and
you could do it standing in line at the grocery store. Nobody's going to know that you're doing it.
No one's going to know.
Right.
I can't drop into child's pose and put my forehead on the floor if I am standing in line at the grocery store. Although I have been that person who has totally dropped on the floor in the middle of an aisle and pulled a child's pose when it was either that or I was probably going to poop my pants in the middle of the grocery store, and I just chose child's pose over that situation.
Right.
So it's, finding these different options that can work in different situations. But bringing it back to loving kindness, allowing yourself to feel like you deserve, you are worthy, you are enough, you get to experiment with what helps you in a kind and safe manner. Because if you don't think that, then where is the love and compassion for yourself?
Right. If we're like, no, I'm too busy. I have to care for everyone else. I don't have time for this. Who am I to deserve this? That's really important to
It's
see
so
that that's
crucial.
the piece. Okay.
Yeah. And even though anxiety has become way more noticeable, it is still really not understood. And I purposely didn't say misunderstood because I think that people who try to understand it can understand it. But there's still a lot of unknowns, and there's a lot that people don't understand about it. And there's a lot of this concept of, well, your life is awesome. What's the problem?
Right. And I'm thinking of a really great friend of mine who's also a podcast listener and a yoga teacher. Shout out to Betty. And she will say to me, like, unless someone has experienced a panic attack, they cannot, I don't think they can get it. So
No.
do you have because what if a yoga teacher says, you know what, a lot of my students are coming to me and saying that they have anxiety, and then they're telling me that yoga is good. And maybe you're the only yoga teacher in your community. And you think, okay, if I run a yoga for anxiety series, what if I haven't had a panic attack? Can I do that? Am I qualified? Some thoughts on that?
I do. Yeah. I would say, first of all, try to seek out a training. There's lots of yoga for anxiety trainings out there, which is phenomenal. And I would say seek out a well-qualified training. And what I mean by that is, I co-teach the yoga for anxiety training often. I have taught it by myself, but my co-teacher is a registered psychologist.
Right.
And so him and I have worked closely together over a long period of time. And there are certain activities that I will do when he is present that I won't do when I'm teaching on my own. For two reasons. One, having another person there to help hold the space is really helpful. But also, there's some that, I can guide it and he can be there to hold people because he has that master's of psychology. And that would be irresponsible of me to lead people into that to then not be prepared for what can possibly come out of it. But so there's lots of trainings that people can take and lots of research. There's great books out there, and sometimes the books on anxiety aren't necessarily they don't necessarily have anxiety in the title. Sharon Salzberg's Loving Kindness is probably my number one recommended book to students. And then, of course, Kristen Neff. I know you referenced the inner critic, and she writes a lot about that in her book Self-Compassion. There's lots of information out there. But what I would say is talk to people with anxiety. Find out what it feels like for them. Find out what helps them and what doesn't help them. I really believe that people do things from the best intention. And it's all well and good to want to educate people, but it's really important to do it in a manner that is kind and educated.
Right. Because I've heard lots of statements that are not coming from a place of education. Like if we only heard one person's story about anxiety and we had never experienced it, An example is I was recently working with someone who had a traumatic brain injury, and before her car accident had no anxiety, and now
Mm-hmm.
since the brain injury has anxiety. So there's a whole different thing for her. You said that you experienced this from the age of 2, so you sort of grew up with it. For her, it was like night and day. Now
Yeah.
you didn't have it your whole life, and now you have this. So everyone's
Yeah.
story is very
And it's very different too in terms of what the prescription can look like because, yes, for some, there is very much a chemical imbalance. And there's research coming out that says that we can change this chemical imbalance. And I'm really excited about that research and looking forward to hearing more about it in the future. And, if I could change my brain chemistry to make it so that I never have anxiety again, I would go for it. Um, that said, I also live with anxiety every day and I am a relatively happy person. I don't allow the anxiety anymore to control my life. And but that doesn't mean that it's not part of my life. There's a big difference between the two. Um, but for some people, it is very situation specific. A traumatic event can absolutely create anxiety. It can also be over a period of time. And it can also be situation specific. I mean, think of how many people have test anxiety.
right.
They may not experience anxiety in any other way, but put a test in front of them and all hell could break loose.
Right. Also, like speaking in front of crowds, some people say that like the two things people are afraid of is public speaking and death.
Yeah,
Right.
totally. Some
Yeah.
people get it when they're driving,
Right.
especially like I know both of us live in Canada. I live in northern Alberta and it's cold. It's supposed to snow here this
I heard
week.
that.
Yeah, so I don't like to talk about that, but but it's really icy here. And I don't know anybody that hasn't skid out at some point. Skidding out doesn't have to be, rolling your car or hitting a snowbank, although most of us have hit a snowbank at some point in our driving careers. Um, but it's nerve wracking. We call it white knuckle driving. In Ontario, I'm from Ottawa, freezing rain is a thing, and freezing rain driving is terrifying. There's all of these places because the reality is that almost everybody has experienced some form of anxiety at some point in their life. Most people have experienced it situationally.
Okay, that's good to know that there's so many different things. So you had mentioned this one word, prescription,
Hmm.
and I'd love for you to get into like, why is it that yoga is helpful? And also, I already know your answer on this, but I want our listeners to hear like yoga is not the only prescription. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in this is my own personal journey. I have been on medication since I was 25. I have gone off my medication a couple of times and very well intentioned, very controlled with my medical team. And both times it did not go well at all. And so it has been a decision of my medical team, my psychiatrist, my general practitioner, my pharmacist. There's a big medical team. Even my alternative medicine doctors are super, super supportive of me taking medication. Um, so that's been part of my prescription. But my psychiatrist, every time I go in, his 3 questions are you still taking your medication at the appropriate dose? Are you still meditating every day? And are you still practicing yoga frequently? And I love that this is my psychiatrist's prescription because yoga and meditation are part of my entire prescription. A prescription doesn't have to be a medical piece of paper that's like, here, you take this to your pharmacy. Um, there's so much research on meditation, and you can look up like Dan Siegel and I'm totally blanking on somebody's name right now. It'll come to me. Who's doing an entire John Kabat-Zinn.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, where they're actually doing a ton of research about what happens to the brain during meditation. So I won't talk about that because that's a whole other topic. Um, but the with yoga, and this can be for any kind of yoga, and I really encourage people to start talking about different types of yoga and start trying different types of yoga because, especially here in the West, and I don't mean Western Canada, I mean like Western society, it's like hot, fast, go. My teacher from India calls it jumping, pumping yoga. And that is so, so beneficial for some people. And for others, it's going to heighten their sensations because they need to be brought down instead. And so then, you have yin and restorative and yoga nidra and meditation and slower flows and grounded flows. That is going to be super beneficial for some, and yet then it's going to bring others too far down into a
Right.
depressive state. So I really, really encourage people to try all kinds of yoga and know that the one that may be good for you may be the one that you hate the most.
Right.
Because usually the people who are like super pitta, and I know that you had an Ayurveda specialist on recently, the super pitta people are like, let's do hot vinyasa.
Mhm.
And really, do they need more heat?
Right.
You know? And then the people who are super kapha and are like, life is so chill and amazing, they're like, let's only do yin. So for them, vinyasa may feel like this is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And the people, I teach a lot of yin, and I teach it very much from a mindfulness standpoint. The people that I hear that hate yin the most are the ones that are like, no, I can't do yin because my brain won't turn off.
Right.
I'm like, that's kind of why you need to do yin.
Yeah.
Because you need to understand that it's okay for your brain not to turn off, but what do you do when your brain won't turn off? So I know that that's like a bit of a cryptic answer because it's not an answer, but this also goes back to the prescription thing of there's not one prescription for every single person. This is why there's tons of different medications. This is why there's acupuncture and naturopathics and chiropractics and, Ayurvedic specialists in all of these things, is that there's not a one size fits all.
Right. Well, and it goes back to what you said, like you can try it, and if it's not working, okay, let's try this other thing for a bit. One thing at a time. Yeah.
And I would say really, try to form a relationship with your teachers, especially if you hated a class. Like, I love when people are coming up to me after class and are like, I really do like when they lead with no offense, but, no offense, but I hated that. My brain wouldn't turn off. I felt like I was going to crawl out of my skin. I was like, awesome. I'm so proud of you for noticing that.
Yeah.
Because they noticed. What's the first thing that they need to do is notice.
Oh, I love it. And it sounds like your answer is no shame. Like, not like,
no.
Well, if you were more enlightened.
Oh my gosh. No. My word. No.
Exactly.
And I get really I wish that the listeners could see that I'm talking with my hands. I'm part Italian and it's just what I do. But I get so excited about it because I wish people would be, and this is again back to loving kindness and compassion. I wish people would just love themselves a little bit more and allow it to be okay that they hated something.
Right. Right. Oh, this is good. So I would love to know, is there anything else that you think, okay, yoga teachers out there, if you haven't experienced an anxiety attack or a panic attack, and maybe you're not going to teach a whole series on it, what are the things that they need to know? Like, what if someone has a panic attack in their class?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a question I get asked a lot. So there's certain things that can happen before a panic attack happens. And I'm sure yoga teachers can attest to seeing this in many classes of lots of fidgeting. If somebody has long hair, playing with their hair, or, taking it down, putting it up, taking it down, putting it up, or fiddling with their mat or their towel, darting eyes, not closing their eyes ever in the practice or in Shavasana. And one note on that, I know in many trainings, including the style of yoga that I've I've practiced mostly, it's really encouraged to close down your eyes. And I think that can be so beautiful and so introspective. But the reality is that for some, closing down the eyes is terrifying. And so, and I know you had Shelley Prosco on about different languaging. And so a languaging thing that I would love people to consider is giving the option of, if it feels available, close down your eyes. Otherwise, find a soft spot where you can rest your gaze. And that gives people the opportunity to rest their eye muscles, but keep their eyes open.
Right.
And that's really made a difference for a lot of my students, just in terms of safety of, okay, I can find a spot on the ceiling or on the floor or on the wall. I tell people they're welcome to stare at me at the front of the room if that makes them feel better. I like them to give me a heads up if that's what they're doing so that I don't think that they're needing something the entire time. But, really being open to, again, not one size fits all. But if somebody does have a panic attack in the class, it's, again, not one size fits all. For some, they're going to need somebody sitting next to them. If somebody has a panic attack in my class, I do like to go over and just say, if you need me, I'm here. Hoping that they can hear me. Normally I get a nod in response, or a acknowledgement that I've spoken. And then I leave them, because, again, I don't know what their best care package is. For those that do have panic attacks in class, I like to check in with them after class. And if they haven't run out, and that does happen, and that's okay. If you can follow up with them by email, if you have their contact, that can be really helpful, just to say, I just wanted to follow up and make sure that you're okay. And if there's anything that that can help you in these times, please tell me so I can help facilitate that in you.
How would you know? You would see them doing all of those things that you said, like fidgeting and whatever, and you would just go over. Because am I wrong to think I just have some people who can't sit still as well in my class?
Yeah, that's totally right. So if they're doing that, then no, I don't go over. It's more like, if I see that they can't breathe, they'll often clutch their chest.
Okay.
And if we think about it too, the vulnerability spot is throat to chest. So people clutch their chest to give themselves, there's so much inherent knowledge in the body that we clutch our chest to help protect ourselves. So think about, when somebody is grieving, or when somebody is trying to give a really heartfelt message, they often will hold their chest. It's a bit of a protection for them. Sometimes they'll drop down into child's pose. Sometimes they'll run out of the room. Sometimes you'll see them crying. I have had people audibly wail in class. That can get a little awkward. But then I'll go, usually if they're audibly wailing, I will go over and help them leave the room. And, sit them right outside the room with a box of Kleenex next to them, maybe get a prop of some kind, whether it's a bolster, a sandbag, just, again, to have that little bit of weight and focus on the body to be able to get back into your body. But, it is a tricky situation. And again, oh gosh, how I wish I could just be like, this is the prescription for when someone has a panic attack. Step 1, do this. But that's not what happens. So, I think really having open communication with your students is really important. And, especially for those that teach some of the, I don't want to say deeper practices, but, I'm thinking of a yin practice where you are holding a pose for a long period of time. Just because your body is still, usually your mind is like, so, there's a little bit more of a risk in that type of practice for stuff to come up. Whereas in a vinyasa style of one breath per movement, you're moving the entire time, and often the brain doesn't have time to go off the rails.
Right.
So to recap on that, if they come down to the ground, if they leave the room, check on them, let them know that you're here, ask them if there's anything that they need. And, you can always teach them the Apan Mudra to even just give them something to do with their hands. and then check in with them after class and see if there's anything that they know to be helpful for them. If there's not, that's where it gets trickier, because then, it's okay, how about you try, what happens if you put your hand on your forehead so that, you're helping the pineal gland and the third eye, everything calm down there. Does that help you? And so that you're giving them a couple of things to take away without trying to fix them. But if they have no idea what to do, that is a time where you say, like, I think you should speak to your doctor about this, because that goes way out of our scope of practice.
What's really fascinating to me is that you're often in what I'm hearing you say is we're not fixing people, which I understand that on a fundamental level. But the other thing I keep hearing in this as you speak is you live with anxiety. So it's not like, oh, I have anxiety, therefore I will do yoga and then it will be gone.
Yeah, that's unrealistic.
Right.
And I mean, some people will probably be like, well, no, because doing yoga really, like, it cured my anxiety. And if that's you, I am so happy. I couldn't be happier for you. I really couldn't. The reality is, the majority of people, one thing is not going to fix it. It may become part of a management plan. I haven't had a panic attack in 6 months. I don't consider myself cured.
Right.
I still live with this. I still work on this every single day. If I decided to stop doing everything and stop doing all of the things that I do daily to help to manage my anxiety, would it come back? I don't actually know that, but I personally don't really feel like testing that.
Right.
Because I am way happier not having 7 panic attacks a day.
Right. So that's what it was. I love how you say, like, this is still something you're living with, and then you're still using the tools. Is there anything else that you think that yoga teachers need to be aware of? Because a lot of people come to yoga for anxiety.
Yeah, they do. And I think one thing to be aware of is that we can't be in anybody else's head. We can't be in anybody else's body. We can't know people's experiences, and we can't know their stories. And I think it's really important to know that, because I think as yoga teachers, we want to help everybody. And, sometimes if we think about what can I do to support this person in this moment, can be a different way of looking at it. I'm not looking to fix them long term. I'm looking to make them see who they are in this moment and be okay with that. And, I think that has to do with ego and perception and so many other things. But, as yoga teachers, all we can do is share the love of what we know to be true and what we know to be helpful.
This is so good. If people want to reach out and work with you, study with you, what is the best place that they can start with, like to go
My
to?
website, for sure, it's withinyouyoga.com. And there's lots of ways to contact me on there and link. I'm on Instagram and Facebook too, which you can find through my website. And I work with people all over. They do not need to be in my city to work with them. And yeah, I just really want people to remember that loving themselves is what they deserve.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, you're welcome, Shannon. And I will share my loving kindness meditation with you to share with others.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you again, Amanda. Connected Yoga Teachers, how was that for you? I know that I've read tons of stuff on anxiety. I have friends who have anxiety. I have yoga teacher friends who tell me about how yoga has helped them. And yet, in today's interview with Amanda, I learned so much beyond what I already knew. So I would love to hear what you learned. What little nugget are you taking away and maybe using in your own practice or in the classes that you share? In our show notes, there are a few links. So we have a link to the Ayurveda episode that we did, episode 128, as well as 2 books that Amanda talked about. Amanda has also shared a loving kindness meditation, as well as a mudra. So those are also over in our show notes. Because you've listened all the way to the end, let me tell you what is coming up next week. Well, first of all, Pelvic Health Professionals opens up. I get so excited about this. This is a group of yoga teachers, PTs, midwives, massage therapists, all kinds of professionals who are eager to learn more about pelvic health and how it can help the people that they're working with. So if you would like to find out about that, make sure you go to pelvichealthprofessionals.com. Next week's podcast episode is what you should consider before you open a yoga studio. This has really been inspired with the many calls that I've done lately, consultation calls with yoga teachers who are either thinking about opening a studio, closing a studio, changing a yoga studio business model. There have been many conversations, and I wanted to condense it into an episode where I really share as much as I can with you of the behind the scenes and some tips and information and some questions to ask yourself. And if you're on my email list, you might know that I was reaching out and saying for episode 150, which is next week, I want to put together a special Q&A episode. Well, guess what? It was taking me a lot of work to do that, and I'm getting there. We're doing it, but it won't be until episode 155 if everything goes as planned. So don't worry, for all of you who have sent in amazing questions, I'm going to get to them. And this might be a regular thing. So if you have a question and you'd like to send it to me, go to theconnectedyogateacher.com and look for the voicemail button on the right-hand side. If you leave a voicemail, I love to play them on the podcast. So tell me who you are, where you are, what you teach. Give yourself a little plug at the beginning of that. Okay, Connected Yoga Teachers, it's time for me to sign off. I want to say a huge thank you to our team over here at the Connected Yoga Teacher, as well as to you, dear listener. And before I sign off, I want to know, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community, so that you can share the yoga that lights you up. Welcome to the... I'll start again now.